Because I think a lot of us have this experience where we have hustled, we have worked, we have climbed the ladder, and then we get to the top and it's like, oh, that was the wrong wall. So it's like, okay, let's say I had everyone's approval at that time. What was that doing for me? Like
Hmm.
I felt like crap on the inside. So
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel, or welcome to the channel if you're new here. We have this incredible coach in front of us today. She's a career transformation coach, and I want you to explain that because I think when people come to coaching, I'm a coach within my institution. A
mm,
lot of times they come with like all these goals, and they're like, I want to get from A to B.
yeah.
But you make sure that people really understand their why and
Mhm.
help us to understand your process when it comes to coaching. I know this we're already diving in before I
Yeah,
even introduced you,
we
but
might
I
as
want to help
well.
explain that.
No,
Yeah.
we might as well. Okay, so if we're going into like just using the framework you were talking about, people come in, I want to go from A to B. First, we want to look at, is B like correct for you, right? Is that the right B?
Oh, totally. Yeah. And the emptiness and the deflation that happens at that moment.
Mhm. Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I heard you on a podcast talking kind of a spiritual awakening.
yeah, yeah.
And when you were describing being up the wrong wall, I had like a spiritual crisis, an existential crisis, a spiritual crisis. I was, oh my gosh, everything I just devoted my whole life to is not at all what I'm
Mm,
interested in doing. Did you feel
yeah.
that?
Yeah, yeah, I did. And I don't think it hit me all at once. It was like this subtle knowing initially where I was starting to discover this whole like fourth year of med school was when I started having my quote unquote spiritual awakening. I started reading books like called The Power of Now, Eckhart Tolle. That was like a big one. I started meditating and I started having this sort of subtle thought that like I don't love medicine and I'm not excited about it. And I don't think I really want to do it. But I remember having this conversation with the guy I was dating at the time. We went on a long road trip and I had him listen, and this is fourth year of med school, right before graduation, like a week before graduation. I had him listen to this podcast of this spiritual teacher who was like really meaningful to me. And she was living this life, like she was living as a digital nomad, doing personal growth, working from cafe, just sort of living the life I wanted. And I had him listen to this podcast and I would pause it every once in a while. And I was like, oh, and this is what she means by that. And like, and I was interjecting and giving him context and just being super excited. And at the end of the episode, he was like, I think you missed your calling. And I was like, yeah, I think so. But we both just assumed I missed it.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I'll get back to introducing you so we can help give people this fuller picture. So in front of us, we have Dr. Chelsea Turgeon. And as we said, she helps people to get back in alignment with what they truly want and desire from life. And that is what she does with her coaching. She is
Yeah.
an author, has a book, Residency Dropout, and it's how I quit my medical career to travel the world and work remotely, which leads us into the fact that she's a digital nomad and has a podcast, which is the Life After Medicine podcast. So, for people who haven't heard your story yet, can you share a little bit more about that?
Yes. So I'm going to give as brief of an overview as possible, and then we can kind of dive into some of the specifics. So I always had this love of psychology. Ever since I was in high school, I would have my parents drop me off at Barnes and Noble, and it was like this closeted love. So I would say that I was studying, but I was going into the personal like self-help aisle and I was reading books about like happiness and personal growth and all of these things. And so then I majored in psychology in undergrad. And at the time, I was like, okay, my two options are I can go to grad school and like become a psychologist and like clinical, PhD, whatever, and go that route, or I can go the route of med school and do psychiatry. And then in my head, I was like, well, that's even better because I can, do the psychologist thing and do talk therapy, but also prescribe meds. And so I can kind of do everything. And so I would present these two paths to people like freshman year of college. And anytime I said med school, I would be met with this response of, oh, wow, like social approval. We're so impressed by
Yep.
you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
looking back, I can very clearly see that that influenced me in such a big way to go down the path of medicine, even though I really wasn't interested in the hard sciences, like organic chemistry was I wasn't interested in those things. The things I was interested in, like my favorite classes in college were social psychology and learning about like personality disorders. And like that's where I loved to learn, but I didn't let myself care that that's what I loved. And I cared more about how other people perceived what I was going to do. And so it's like I had this sort of hunger for approval that so many of us have. And I really let that dictate my career decisions, kind of unbeknownst to me at the time. I just sort of convinced myself that I wanted to go to med school. So it's like when I look back, I see I chose medicine for quote unquote the wrong reasons. And when I say wrong, it's just reasons that were not authentic to me,
Yeah.
reasons that were not gonna play out well in the long run. And so then I just kind of spent like all of med school, the first 2 years of residency, first year and a half of residency, trying to force myself to fit in to this system that just wasn't right for me all along. And I experienced a lot of burnout. I experienced a lot of like anxiety. I started having panic attacks, started to just be more and more disconnected from myself, and started to have all of these other consequences in my life, like just feeling like I was, disconnected from my family and friends, and just kind of got to this place where I felt really alone and I felt really unhappy. And it's like I kind of was waking up to this, like, what have I done with my life? Like, where am I? What am I doing? Like what's the point of me being here and pursuing this? And so I hit this really rock bottom of burnout. My During my second year of residency, I ended up taking a leave of absence and actually spending 5 weeks connecting back to myself. That whole time I had been disconnecting, and then I finally was like connecting back to myself. And when I did that, it became very clear that medicine was not the right path for me. And like I didn't totally know what I was going to do, but I just knew I couldn't go back. And so I turned in my resignation, and I had some ideas of like wanting to start an online business. I wanted to do something online. I wanted to travel, wanted to be an entrepreneur. And so I started a travel blog. I got a coaching certification. This is like back in 2018, as it's, before everyone in the whole world is coaching. And then I bought a ticket to South Korea and got a job there teaching English. And that was something I did to pay the bills while I started building up my online business. And yeah, that was almost 5 years ago. I'm about to celebrate my 5-year travel anniversary,
Wow.
February 19th. And yeah, so now I'm here in Buenos Aires, and I've had 2 years of a six-figure business. So I've generated over $250,000 in revenue just in the past 2 years alone in my business. And I, work remotely. I travel, I help people, I like do all the things that I like always wanted to do. And so that's kind of where I am today.
I love it. And thinking about where you didn't thrive, it's like this boxed in. When I see you now on social media and the things you're doing, it's just very free. It's like Chelsea does not belong in a structured system that has limitations. So
Yeah.
the one thing I can't relate to is the love for travel that I watch and on, like, because I always wanted to do the Airbnb thing in the nation, but when you have so much courage to explore the world, have you always been interested in traveling?
I don't think that's always been an interest for me. It actually started out as hiking was the interest that I developed. And the reason I started hiking was because I had a dog in med school, and I just had all this guilt that I was like such a bad dog mom. And I was like, how can I be a better dog mom? I'm going to start taking him on walks, and then, oh, I can take him on hikes. And so I started doing that. And then I just wanted to hike in more places that were more beautiful. And so it really started as this love for nature and hiking and camping and all of these things. And then it kind of perpetuated into, I was like, oh, there's really cool hikes in other countries. And that's how it started to grow. And I would also say during the interview trail, so in med school during fourth year, you like interview at 100 different places. And so I did start like quote unquote traveling during that, as in I would it was the first time I like went on a plane by myself to a destination where I didn't know anyone when I got there. And there was something really interesting about that process for me. And I did start to enjoy just like going to airports and, oh, taking public transport. And I don't know, there was just a lot of fun and possibility that I enjoyed during that process. And so then, yeah, so, but I was not someone who like always loved to travel, and I really didn't travel much at all before I sold all my stuff and went to South Korea. So that was kind of a
Yeah.
out of left field sort of thing.
Yes. And now we'll step them back because I have so many things I'd love to touch base on from different points in your journey. I really relate to the psychology interest.
Mhm,
I was obsessed with psychology and sociology, but I did dentistry because of the psychosocial well-being related to our face. And I just
mhm,
never connected. So when you were talking, I'm like, I'm sure other people can connect with what you were saying about just never really felt like I was in the right place. A lot of
mhm,
times people say, well, my parents expected me to be XYZ.
mhm.
So
Yeah,
that's what I did.
yeah.
And how did you give yourself permission when you said, you know what, I'm done with this. I'm going to pivot?
Yeah, it would be really cute if I gave myself permission from a place of like basically I had to hit like a rock bottom to
Yep.
give myself permission. Like
I
it
relate.
wasn't
Yeah.
it wasn't as much of a permission as like a surrender to like I feel so crappy in my day-to-day existence and I don't want to keep going. Like I wouldn't say I had like active like suicidal ideation, but I definitely had this like it's like I would wake up every morning and be like I wish I didn't wake up. Like I wish I wasn't here. And it gets to that point where you're living like that every day and then I just finally had to surrender and be like, this is not working. Like, I cannot keep doing life like this. And if this is the way, it's like, this is the way I knew how to do it. And it got me here. And so I'm just going to sort of surrender it up. And I don't know what the answer is going to be or like how to get out of this, but I'm just going to surrender. And when I did that, that's when my program director sort of like called me into her office and was like, hey, people have noticed that you're not thriving. People have noticed that like something's up. What do you want to do? And she basically just offered me a 5 week leave of absence paid. And it was like that was sort of the answer that I needed to come back to myself and finally have a sense of connection. So it's like, yes, I gave myself permission, but really it started off as like this rock bottom surrender.
I relate a lot to that. And it's the challenge is to get people in that messy middle where they're content, but no, they're not in the right place, right?
I know. Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard because I think a lot of us who went into healthcare are pretty stubborn and pretty like we have a pretty high pain tolerance. We have a very low risk tolerance, but a really high pain tolerance. And so we're just good at tolerating things being so bad. And I don't know the best way to do that. I think some things you can do is sort of like crank up the pain gear on yourself and really just start to think about, okay, well, yes, it's a mediocre, I call it like the mediocre middle. You're in the mediocre middle, but like, what if that's your whole life? Like if your whole life is made of the mediocre middle, how painful is that for you? And then like starting to kind of crank up the pain that way. Cause I think people really just don't make changes that are scary unless there's like pain. Like we
Mhm.
just have loss aversion. And so it's harder for us to just move towards pleasure. And it's pain is just like an easier motivator and it's a more like effective motivator for something like that.
I have how good are you willing to let it get is in my head. It's I hear Sarah Seidelman say it. Like how good
Mm,
are you willing to let it get?
yeah.
And that's a question that I don't think a lot of us, depending on what place we're in, like when you're in that
Mhm.
state of rock bottom, I find it so hard to think clearly, first of all, but also creative, like have any sort of creative
Mhm.
juices
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
options in your life. So you
Yeah.
were able to utilize that 5 weeks. And I'll say I took a leave of absence and I did not use it well. I coached myself into going back into
Yeah.
residency
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and I just wasn't even giving myself time to breathe and use it. So how did you use it?
Yeah. And I have a podcast episode, which I'll send to you because it's like super relevant to this, where it's like I go into it, I literally read my journal entry of the first day of my leave of absence where I set out my intentions and my schedule and like how I'm gonna do it. And like I don't know how I came up with that at
Wow.
that time, but I did. And so so I think that's really powerful, but I'll just give you like an outline now. It like I decided I was like, what is really important to me about about this time? And I was like, okay, I don't have to figure out my whole life. I just need to figure out the one question of, do I want to be a doctor or not? And I mean, that's a huge question, but what a lot of people struggle with is they're trying to make a decision based on contingencies of other decisions. So they're trying to make a decision like, okay, well, do I want to go into medicine? Well, or do I want to keep doing this residency? Okay, well, maybe if I can figure out this one part, or if I could transfer to this other thing, then I could do, like, they're trying to make all these branches and it gets them really confused. And you just have to bring it to one binary decision of like, do I want to do this? Yes or no. If yes, if I do want to be a doctor, then like, then I just need to figure out how I can do that in a way that makes sense for me, in a way that doesn't like, do like, maybe I could change residencies or specialties, right? So then I can kind of figure out problem solve there. If no, then I will figure out my next step. So it was sort of this trust of, whatever it is, I have the resources and capacity to figure out a plan forward. But first I need to answer, do I want to be a doctor? Yes or no. So one is like, have a binary decision that you're trying to make. The other thing is, I did not talk to anyone
Mhm.
about, like, people wanted to, I had so many messages from people in my program, my parents, and like they were trying to get there for like, many people were trying to talk to me and give me their really well-intentioned but unsolicited advice around what I should do or try to problem solve with me. And I just sort of politely was like, I'm not discussing this with anyone. This is a me process and I need to do this myself. And then I slept as much as I wanted to. In the first 2 weeks was a lot of sleeping. I meditated every day. I journaled every day. I tried to just spend as much time in nature as I could. And the first like 2 to 3 weeks, I didn't like force a decision. I was like, no, nothing's coming and that's okay. I don't really know. But then after week 3, I finally like had clarity and had a decision. So it was just like, keep doing the thing, like keep connecting to yourself and showing up for yourself. And even though like the first 2 weeks for sure I was journaling and I had no clue, I had no clarity, but I just kept doing it every day. I kept meditating every day. I kept just being in silence and connecting to myself every day and just trusted that eventually something was gonna some answer was gonna drop down, and it did.
That is such wisdom.
Yeah.
It's in that place of stillness that we find clarity, but our world is so obsessed with being busy all the time.
Yeah.
I am amazed. And then how did you develop all the insights to create that time for yourself?
I think it's just one of those things where I had been on enough of my little spiritual quest. So, like, to just go back a little bit, I was not happy first and second year of med school, but I kept thinking, okay, once I get into the clinics, I did my delayed gratification. Once I
Yeah.
get into the clinics and I'm actually helping people, it'll be better. And then it was way worse. Like, I was like, oh, first and second year were actually much better compared to this because I don't mind studying and having my own schedule. What I do mind is being told where to be and when. And so everything started to feel a lot heavier. And it's like I started to fundamentally question everything. I was like, what am I, just having like one of those existential crises
Yeah.
when you're you keep telling yourself something will get better when this one thing happens. And then you finally start to see that's not happening. Like that's not true. And then I started questioning everything. And so then I was just sort of looking for resources on, like, what do you do when everything sucks and you're not happy? And I found some podcasts, which introduced like about personal growth and spirituality. And that introduced me to the books like Eckhart Tolle, Power of Now. That introduced me to other authors. Like I read Gabby Bernstein, and the Course in Miracles. So it just sort of like kind of went down this little rabbit hole of spirituality. And I started to just get this sense of like, I think there's like answers inside of me.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah.
Yeah. And I wasn't practicing it a lot at that point, but I had about 2 years under my belt of like low key reading about some of these things and feeling like, I think there's something here. And then I was like, all right, game time. Go, like, let's do this. Let me connect to this intuition character. And and see what happens. And yeah, I mean, if there's nothing else people get from this, it's like spend 15 minutes in silence every day.
And I would recommend even the processing through writing. I know a lot of people don't feel that they're writers, quote unquote, but that processing and to have it to look back on, I was
Yeah.
just looking back on my notes, and each of them goes down to like, I think I'm having a spiritual crisis. Like, I think I'm going to cancel my therapy appointments because I think this is a spiritual crisis. And I just kept coming down to that because I couldn't find any answers outside of myself, as you were saying.
Mhm.
And I was so exhausted. And as you pointed out, we had gotten to where we were because you had followed other people's recommendations. So when you chose to set that boundary, I just want to applaud that, like
Yeah.
awareness of, okay, last time I listened to what people said and it got me here. So now I'm going to try to figure out what's coming on from the inside.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know, like to be honest, I don't know if that was totally from like me being this like badass boundary queen place at the time. I think I was just like almost scared even to like hear what anyone else wanted to say. Um and like almost afraid to let people into what I was actually thinking because I think a part of me knew like I don't want to keep doing medicine. But I was afraid to like actually say that to other people until I felt clearer in myself. So I don't know if it was really from this deep place. But I guess there was some level of self-trust that like I'm the one who needs to figure this out.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Especially you were OBGYN and
Mhm.
anything with some surgical aspects to it. I was always told you have to be very sure that you want to do surgery in order to pursue surgery. And so the people who often find me, I left surgery. It's like, well, now I'm a safe space to consider whether or not you want to stay or leave because I
Yeah.
left. But often, and I don't know how it is across spectrums of specialties, but the idea of quitting, like to
Yeah.
me, the idea of quitting felt like I was a failure.
Yeah.
And now when I hear your story, I'm like, well, if you stayed, that would have been failing yourself. So like I would not have projected that on you at all.
Yeah. That's really interesting to think about how the same event, when it's you internalize that as a failure, but then when you look at someone else, that's not the first thing that you see. And so I think that's just like really interesting to notice that we're kind of like the lens or the standard maybe we hold ourselves to or the lens that we put towards ourselves is like very skewed from what we view other people doing.
Yeah, but a lot of times, and I think you mentioned this in your book and in discussions where not everybody is supportive, right? So a lot of times people that hear anyone, even if they've practiced for, they're in retirement and they're thinking about leaving medicine, it's like the idea of leaving medicine, people feel betrayed and then they project that betrayal onto others. And so a lot of the fear of people even considering leaving clinical medicine now is, what is so and so going to say about me? And
Yeah.
how did that play out in your life?
Yeah. So I remember being really afraid of that for the longest time. And so like all the way leading up until my leave of absence, like every other day there was a part of me that was like, I just want to quit. I want to leave. But I would worry, and it was like one or two of my specific co-residents that I was closest to. I remember worrying, like, well, what would they think of me? I don't think we would still be friends. And it was this really interesting thing of like, it like I was saying, what would people think? But actually, it was a few specific people that I really cared the most about. Um, and then I had this like one night where I was like laying in bed on Instagram, like hating my life, and then looking at the Instagrams of one of these people that was in my co-residency class and was like on her stories, like she's like living her life. And I was like, I'm really miserable and I care what she thinks, but she's not here with me right now, living this miserable moment. And nor should she be, but like I'm the one with me living my life. Like I'm the only person who actually has to deal with all the consequences of my actions every moment of every day. And so shouldn't I get the most say
Yeah.
of what I do with those actions? Because I'm the one who actually has to go through all the consequences. And it was like, it sounds very obvious, but like in that one moment, I was like, just starting to be a little more liberated from the sense that like, it was, it was like my opinion all of a sudden was weighted more then like I
Mhm.
still cared what they were thinking, what I was perceiving about what they were thinking, but my opinion weighed a little bit more. And then it just started to grow from there.
I love the concept of like, why does that person's opinion matter more than my opinion of myself? Right? And a lot of times it comes from like a self-worth place or constantly being in that people pleasing. Like when I heard you talking, it reminded me of when I finally accepted that to be true. It's like, why am I so worried what that person is going to think about me? But I hadn't yet developed a sense of self, a sense of self love, self compassion. So the answer
Mhm.
is not in try to get them to love me more. It's how do I love myself more in order
Mhm.
for my opinion to matter? Is that what you were developing, or what did that look like?
Yeah, yeah. And then it was also like sort of what I came to was, yeah, just another realization I had was, okay, in this moment in time, I think like everyone approves of my life, right? If I took a poll, kind of a general poll of like, hey, I'm a doctor, I'm, becoming certified in OBGYN. If you wrote on paper my life and I polled everyone, they would be met with like approval, yep, stamp, she's doing great. So it's like, okay, let's say I had everyone's approval at that time. What was that doing for me? Like
Mm-hmm.
I felt like crap on the inside.
Yeah.
So I think there was just this realization of like, okay, I have their approval and like that's not doing anything for me. So like maybe not that I don't want that, but it's not the answer. Like the reason I want people's approval is because I thought it was going to make me feel better and yet I don't feel better. So
Mm-hmm.
you kind of like, yeah, I was just like hitting that point where I was like, I have everyone's approval and
That is so fascinating, isn't it? Hmm. Yep. I love that you pointed that out.
yeah. Yeah. So it's like I personally like lived a lot of these things. It's like I lived the formula. I played by the formula that I thought was supposed to bring me happiness, and through my own experience, realized that did not work for me. Let me try. So, well, I mean, I tried it several times, and then finally, it's like, okay, I'm just gonna try something different. Let me just try a different approach.
This is fantastic. And of course, everyone that is thinking about career transitions, we have to talk about the financial aspect. So I
Yeah.
know you've mentioned you had student loans and I've heard your perspective on student loans. They were amazing and different than mine, who was afraid and had to pay off my loans as fast as possible because I was so weighted down by the concept of loans. I'd love for you to share your perspective and what the financial aspect of this transition looked like for you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I'll just go back to sort of a little bit of my backstory. I was raised by a dad who loved Dave Ramsey. For Father's Day one year, he literally was like, the only thing I want for Father's Day is that you guys sit with me this Saturday and do financial freedom for the next generation. So we had to watch Dave Ramsey and do these workbooks. And so it's like, I have been indoctrinated like everybody else that like debt is bad, pay everything in cash, don't take on any loan. Like my parents also literally tried to convince me to go into the military route for med school so that I wouldn't have any loans, right? Like I did not take out any loans for undergrad. I got a full scholarship. Um, and so I didn't have to like pay anything for undergrad. So it's like all of these things, like I had been very much conditioned that like
Yeah.
this was bad. I needed to pay back my loans as soon as possible. And so for the longest time, I just sort of accepted that, well, I missed my calling because I can't leave because I have the loans. And so I remember being on a call with a physician burnout coach. This was during my 5 week leave of absence. So the one person I did talk to was a coach who like actually helped me just, turn inwards. And she was asking like, okay, what would be your ideal day in the life? Like, what would you love it to look like? And I describe I'm getting up and doing self-care in the morning and going to cafes and describing a day that has nothing to do with medicine. And then she points that out and I was like, oh yeah, it's nothing to do with medicine. So okay. And then she's like, okay, well, what's keeping you from getting that? Very standard coaching question. And I was like, oh, the money. And then she was like, okay, anything else? And I like looked in and I was like, check in, like, is there anything else keeping me? And I was like, no, that's literally it. It's literally the money. And it was something weird about having that put right out in front of me that like the only thing keeping me from doing what I really want to do is the money. And I was like, that's just actually not acceptable. So it
Mm.
was like in that moment that I was like, you know what? I need to figure this out, right? Clearly, this can be figured out, because I just don't want it to be that the only thing keeping me from doing what I want to do is money. So then I had this sort of determination to figure it out and start looking at it differently and thinking about it differently. And that's when I started to just like shift my perspective of like, wait, why am I so in a hurry? Like, why do I feel like I have to pay this off immediately, right away? Like, why did that feel like such a big deal? And it's like, obviously, oh, the interest rises and interest rise. And I was like, you know what? I don't really know how I let that go. I just sort of decided I'm just gonna pay them back $1 at a time. It just started to seem really absurd to me that I would let this like kind of imaginary number on a computer somewhere dictate like what I was going to do with my future. It just like it felt way less real to me. Like my student loan balance felt less real to me than like my everyday life.
Mm.
And so I was like, okay, I'm just going to pay it off $1 at a time. And then in my head, I was like, you know, if I can just find a way to make six figures outside of medicine, even if it's a little delayed from like what I would have done in like staying on this path, I'll be okay. Like it didn't need to be immediate. I was like, you know, it'll just be, I'll figure out a way to pay it off if I can find out how to make six figures. And so I was like, all right, cool. I'm just going to do that. I'm just going to make six figures outside of medicine and I'm figure that out. And so that's sort of how I came to that.
Jim Carrey wrote himself a check for $10 million. Do you hear about that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And you set the intentions and then make it happen. Because if we focus on the debt, I find a lot of physicians have money scarcity, and I am not an exception for that.
Yeah.
But also thinking about, I am currently the only one working in healthcare in my family, and I've made the least. And I'm like,
Yeah.
so anytime I have this belief that like medicine, I have to stay in medicine for the money, I'm like, I am making the least. And I have so many jobs where I've been doing the work for free because I work in academia. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like it's definitely not the finances keeping me here,
Yeah.
but but it kind of was until I sat myself down and said, what's the reality of that? And so many times, and I love that you pointed out the role of the coach in helping you navigate that for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll say like there are realities to money for sure. Like the reality of all of this was I did accept earning less for a few years while I figured out what I was like, while I figured out how to build a business. So that really was a reality to it that there was about 3 years. Let's see, I left in 2019, beginning of 2019. And then the first year my business made six figures was 2022. So 2019, 2020, 2021 were pretty like just getting by sort of years where I taught in South Korea, teaching English. I did a bunch of things on the side, like I did online jobs. I have an episode about that too, like all the weird ways I made money before my coaching business took off. And I was just,
Your mind can go into so many different ways for anybody that's popping up. It's
yeah,
like,
there was nothing sexual involved. It was all
I,
legal and
I'm very PG in my brain, so but I anticipate when people hear that, they'll have a lot of ideas that come up to their
there
head.
were weird ways. And
Yeah.
so it's like it is real. And what I also want to show is like there's so I just sort of accepted that like, you know what? I'm gonna be in make ends meet kind of mode for a bit and I'm gonna do income based for payments and I'm gonna like, you know, pay them off $1 at a time. So I'm gonna still do that and pay the bills. And but like I had a vision that like this is a temporary period of time and it's leading me to something. And it was because like you set the intention, but also I took so much consistent action towards that intention and I didn't give up. And I like, you know, it took a lot. Like I'm not gonna pretend like it was easy to build up a business to six figures when I had all this conditioning around money that told me I shouldn't earn in a way that was joyful. So there was a lot of work to be done on the inside and the outside, but it really is possible.
And for people who don't know what you do, can you share what your life look like now?
Yeah, yeah. So my main sort of source of income, the way I support myself, is through my work as a coach. So I'm a career transformation coach, like you said. The big transformation is approaching your career from the inside out instead of outside in, meaning from what you want to do, what your strengths are, what your zone of genius is, and building a career in life that fit that instead of looking around at like, what are the options? What are other people doing? And trying to fit yourself into that. That's like outside in. Probably if you're unhappy, burnout, that's probably why. And so I help people reverse that. We transform it by transforming our approach really from the inside out. And so I lead groups of people through that. I have one-to-one work that I do with that. And so that's sort of my main thing that I'm doing for income. And then I have a podcast where I just put out as much content that as I can to help people come to that place where they have a career that gives them freedom and fulfillment. And then I travel. So I've been traveling. I've literally over the past, since I started in 2019, I've lived and worked in over 40 countries. And that's wild.
And how do you do, so if you're a business, do you have an address in the United States or how does that work?
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
use my parents' home address, and my business is like filed in Alabama, like it's registered in Alabama. And then I have a tax person who like works specifically with nomads, with people like me who don't live in the US. And so there's this cool like tax thing we do. It's like foreign earned income. So it's like I have all the things there's all the legal stuff in place around all of
Nice.
that.
Yeah, not to throw you on the
Yeah.
spot there, but
No,
that just a surface level question for anyone who's thinking now they want to pick up their bags and do the work. Things that they need
yeah.
to consider would be,
Yeah. Well, I think it's like, how do I say this? All the obstacles that we think are like really insurmountable, they're just not.
yeah.
Like there are actually not obstacles that can't be figured out through just doing some research.
And
Nah,
if you're in
it's really
medicine,
not.
you're probably pretty great at studying and looking things up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think what makes us feel like obstacles are insurmountable is fear, but it's not the logistics of the obstacle. Like you can figure out any logistics. It is honestly all figure outable. But it's just like the fear that prevents us from being able to figure it out.
So I want to help people to find you. So we'll go through, you've said a few things. So where can they find your website for the coaching?
Yeah, so coachchelsemd.com. That'll just be kind of your one-stop shop where you have all the different links to where you can find me.
And it will have the podcast, which remind them what it's called.
Life After Medicine.
And to follow you on your journey everywhere, your Instagram.
Yeah. If you want to follow my travel stuff, like my daily travel adventures, I post a lot of that on Instagram stories.
And what's your Instagram handle?
At Coach Chels MD.
I'm going to have all of those links in the description below. And what would be your main takeaways from our discussion today?
Like what you want matters. If you're unfulfilled or unhappy in your life, it's okay to ask questions about why, like about why that is. And it's also okay to pivot. It's like your Facebook group, right? Permission to
Permission to
pivot.
pivot.
You're allowed to pivot. Like you're just literally allowed to do that. It's so funny. Quick thing. I posted this thing on LinkedIn about my story and my pivot, and all of these like old white men are commenting on it. Oh, it's so sad you couldn't figure out anything to do in healthcare. Oh, it's so sad that you left. I'm like, no, it's not sad. It's wonderful. So
It
like,
drives me crazy when people are judging. People will tell me, I'll say I'm struggling, and because I look fine, so I have an eating disorder, right? And if I say I'm struggling with it, someone, a white man, is like, "No, you look fine." I'm like, I'm. I'm not even gonna.
thank you
I'm
for
not
dismissing
gonna have
my
this
experience.
discussion. Like I was just saying, I was struggling. It was people tell you about your life. I'm so over it. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, clearly, like he was a friend of mine, so I was being open. It's like, how you doing? I'm like, I'm doing fine. And then I was like a little bit tearful. He's like, are you sure? I just a little bit struggle. He's like, no, you're not. You're doing great. You look fine. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm going
That's so cool
to,
that you're the expert on my experience.
yes.
How did you get that expertise? That's incredible.
And I always just like, you know what? He was doing the best he could to support me. I know his intentions were not bad. It's like your whole brain is trying to justify why his reaction was okay, but like also validating that, okay, whatever. But that is quite interesting. and
Yeah.
showcases the point of why we need to discard the external validation in order to
Yeah.
really tap in to
Yeah.
what we
Yeah.
want.
It's like permission to pivot, and pivots are not sad. Pivots are like when it means you're choosing yourself, it's such a win.
Yeah. To reframe the quitting to you're moving on to something new. And
Yeah.
I like to reframe the
Also,
failure. Mhm.
people love when you quit smoking and you quit drugs. So like why can't quitting addictive people pleasing also be something we celebrate?
Yeah, why can't we quit overwork, people pleasing, and living for others when it's killing our soul?
Yeah. It's literally the same thing. So like let's just normalize that.
I love this takeaway. We're going to end on that. So good. Thank you so much, Chelsea, for being here and sharing your story and your voice and your messages, and keep being you. Not that my opinion matters.
Thank you so much for having me.